the president of the Westport History Association, a guy who's been doing that job for a long while, is a good personal friend, and is a published author who's written a book, which whose title I've already forgotten, because I haven't seen it yet.
It's actually called Ingenious Machinists. It's a history of the early industrial revolution in New England.
New England's impact on the early industrial revolution. Tony is a very avid historian and a very talented speaker and writer. Has been running many well-attended events in the Westport Historical Society, and probably the most notable achievement, among the list of many, is the acquisition of the Handy House, one of the two magnificent houses that still stand in Old Dartmouth. And some other time we'll have a presentation about that. But tonight he's going to talk about a favorite subject that he's an avid student of. It's called slavery. He's got 5 sketches regarding slavery in Old Dartmouth.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. This is a variation on a program that I did in Westport last year. It's changed a little bit, a few new things on the subject of slavery. Not a pleasant topic, obviously, but one that we know is important. And it's not that I'm, suddenly uncovering slavery here. People have known about it, of course. It's not a secret. Although I think some of the things you might hear tonight might be new. These are sketches. I call them 5 sketches on slavery and the slave trade. Sketches because some of them are not really complete. They're things that I might cover in 10 minutes that do need further research, and I hope that research will get done over time. I don't have any slides. I didn't do a slide presentation here. Needless to say, most of the stuff I'm talking about is a couple hundred years old, and you don't have visuals from it. So your only visual tonight is me.
There you go.
Okay. So the first of these sketches is about slavery itself. There was no official slavery in Dartmouth, the current town of Dartmouth. There was in Old Dartmouth, but all of the towns that came out of Dartmouth, Westport, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet, that came out of Old Dartmouth, they were all founded in 1787 or later. And slavery in Massachusetts ended before that, and 4 years before that, 1783. It was made illegal, and not because of the legislature, but because of the judiciary. There were several cases of slaves suing for their freedom, and the judges, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, determined, quite rightly, of course, that slavery was incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. We can only wish that the national Constitution had been interpreted the same way. So there wasn't slavery in Westport, for example, but there was slavery in the part of Dartmouth that became Westport, which is what the one sketch about this that I'm going to talk about is based on slavery, based on Westport. And it's actually what Bob just mentioned at the Handy House. How many of you have been to the Handy House? Great 1710, 1712 building, and kind of really the pride of the Westport Historical Society. And so we'll be talking about slavery there tonight. I don't know how many slaves there were in Old Dartmouth. Maybe other people have got more information. There was a census in 1754, so this is back in colonial times. And that one said that there were 5,000 slaves in Massachusetts at that time. And 34 adult slaves in Dartmouth. Now this is, again, Old Dartmouth, but the big town of Dartmouth. So 34. That was in 1754. About 20 years later, there was a large increase in slavery for reasons that I'm not quite sure about. But in 1776, right, here we are, just into the American Revolution, in Bristol County, so in all of Bristol County, there were 585 slaves, and most of them were either in Taunton or in Dartmouth, Old Dartmouth. So there were quite a few, about 37 adult slaves had really increased over that 20-year period. What we do need, and it's going to take a lot of research in census data and genealogical and probate data and so forth to try to get more specific numbers, but we certainly don't have exact numbers. Quite a few of the names of the slave owners are going to be names that you've heard of before, so the important families of Old Dartmouth. But we have to keep in mind that it was, at the time, perfectly legal. In some ways it's surprising. You think of Old Dartmouth as a place that was really influenced greatly by Quakers. And we have this notion Quakers were anti-slavery. Baptists were very important here, Baptists, at least in the north, anti-slavery. But the fact is that the Quakers really didn't get very strict about their anti-slavery until about 1750, so just a little bit before the Revolutionary War. And in what's kind of an irony, about the time that they became more strident, the Quakers that is, about slavery, they also became more strident about their Quaker religion in general. And they started getting very strict with people who were not following the old ways. Women who wore fancy dresses or wore jewelry, or men who joined the military. People who married outside the Quaker religion. And so, oddly enough, as they became more strident in their anti-slavery, they also, their numbers diminished greatly. So that lessened their influence. Just kind of an irony of the history. The Baptists also became anti-slavery in the North, but that really wasn't until after the Revolution. So about the time we're talking about, Old Dartmouth didn't have particularly strong anti-slavery sentiments, but there was some bit of it there anyway. The Handy House, as I was talking about, what was really the Cadman White Handy House. The Handys weren't until mostly until the 19th century. George Cadman was the person who owned that land where the Handy House is. Those who haven't been there, is at the corner of Hicksbridge Road and Drift Road in Westport, with land going really from Drift Road, from beyond Drift Road, all the way down to the water. He built that house for his daughter Elizabeth and her husband, whose name was William White. They were a Mayflower family. We know that George Cadman, who did not live there, but George Cadman, the father, did have a slave whose name was James. We know about it because he was freed in George Cadman's will. But he doesn't, what he says is that he will be freed in a period of time 3 3/4 years away. Very odd, and you don't know why that was. Was it because James would have reached a certain age by then? Maybe he was 21 then, you don't know. Maybe he had a certain number of years of service, of servitude. We really don't know. So it's kind of one of those odd things, but it shows up multiple times. We have no evidence of Elizabeth, the first one to live in the Handy House, and her husband, William, having slaves. There's no record of it. But she was an only child, and she herself had 11 children. She needed help. No question about it. She had no brothers and sisters, no aunts and uncles with these kids. So it's possible that they did have servants of some sort. Whether they were slaves or not, we really don't know. But we do know that their son George had slaves, and George inherited the Handy House. He lived there. And his will, which was written in 1762, specifies that 2 slaves, one named Zip, Z-I-P, Zip, and Violet, V-I-L-O-T, Violet, would be freed And they specify a date, March of 1766, which is 3¼ years away from the time that the will was written. Again, this very odd thing of saying, we're not going to do it now, but we're going to do it in some specified period of time. Again, we don't know why. We don't know, in these cases anyway, was it because there were two different people, it probably wasn't age-related. It wasn't that they were going to turn 21 or 25, so we know it's not that. What, years of servitude? We have no idea. No idea. At least I don't. So, but he does specify that. We know only one thing about Violet, and that is she married a man named Pero Snell several years after that period of time, after she gained her freedom. And no record beyond that. But Zip, we know a bit more about. He married a woman named Elizabeth David, who was a Wampanoag Indian. And he did it in that period of time while he had said he was going to get his freedom, but hadn't yet got it. So he wasn't free yet. He was still a slave when he got married. But he was in that period of time where he knew he was going to be free. His wife was not a slave. She was a Native American from the area. We also know that they got land from the White family. And Richard Gifford has been helping me with this, with land records. We know that they got that land. I don't know when they got that land. It was pre-1774, so it was sometime after he was freed. But we don't actually know when. By the time there are any documents that Richard can come up with, it just mentions that he had already been living there. So we don't really know when that was. But he did get some land in what is now Westport. We also know that Zip and Elizabeth had 4 children, 2 sons, Joseph and Job, which we don't know much about, at least I don't. They had 2 daughters that we know more about. One of them married John Cuffey, Paul Cuffey's brother. So she would have been sister-in-law of Paul Cuffey. This is also interesting because they married the Cuffeys. So here's Jane, who is African and Native American. And she marries John Cuffey, who is African and Native American. So you find a lot of this in Westport. I don't know if the same is true in all of Old Dartmouth, but we see an awful lot of Wampanoag and Black mix in our history. Their second daughter is the more well-known Charlotte White. So many of us have heard about Charlotte White, the herbalist and healer, Charlotte White. And we could go off on her, but most of you anyway know who Charlotte White was. So Zip may have led a life of servitude, mostly of servitude, and relative obscurity. But to me it's interesting that his daughter is remembered in the name of one of the major streets of Westport. There's a third slave named Dinah White, who had a less fortunate time even after freedom. She doesn't show up in George's will. She may have only been freed at the point where slavery became illegal in Massachusetts. You've got no record of her having been freed before that. But she shows up in the town records in need of poor relief. And from the Westport town records it says, Negro woman late the property of George White, deceased, of Dartmouth, now residing in the town of Westport, not in a capacity to support herself, and the heirs of the said George White, though requested, refuseth to support the said Dinah. So they said, we have no responsibility for her whatsoever. So other citizens of Westport ended up supporting her. And they, as typically happened, if someone supported someone who was on poor relief, they could go to the town for reimbursement. And these people said, we've been taking care of Dinah White, we want some reimbursement. And the town said no. So this went on for at least 12 years that she shows up in that, and I'm assuming at that point she just died. So Dinah might have been free, but clearly the lingering effects of slavery haunted the rest of her days. My second story is about a man named Barney Hicks. Those of you who know something about Westport might know about the Barney Hicks house, which is about halfway between Westport Point and Central Village.
Excuse me,
Sure.
I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. Halfway between Westport Point and Central Village, an old farmhouse that's there, the Barney Hicks house. Barney was 20 years old when the Revolution broke out in 1775, and he enlisted in the Continental Army, which is unusual, I think. Most people, if they joined some sort of military for the Revolution, they would have joined a local militia. But he goes in the Continental Army with a Rhode Island outfit. After a few months, he came home and got into the West Indies trade, which was also a very patriotic thing to do, as it turns out, because if you were, at this time, the British are blockading all the ocean along the south coast here, from Newport in particular. And so if you were out there in a sloop of some sort, going back and forth to the Caribbean islands, you were probably picking up things that were going to help the Patriot cause, such as gunpowder, for example. And so you'd have to try to get through the British blockade, both coming and going, so that it was another way of serving. You didn't have to be in the militia or the army. You could actually serve that way. But it was risky. And on his first day out, he got caught by the British Navy. So they towed his ship to Long Island. This is in the winter. There was a storm. The ship broke loose and was tossed about in the storm. And he ends up on an island off the coast of New Jersey in the middle of the winter. And he's the only survivor. But in the process, through frostbite, he loses one leg. It takes him a year to recuperate. He gets found. Luckily, somebody on the mainland looks over and they see that there's somebody out there. They go out and they find him and take care of him. He recuperates and goes to Philadelphia and decides that he's going to organize a privateer. Now, privateers, as you might know, are boats with a captain and a crew that would prey on British shipping. They didn't go against they didn't look for the British Navy, tried to avoid the British Navy, and to try to find an unarmed or poorly armed cargo ship, and they would take that ship and bring it into what they called a prize port, which could be Bedford Village, no doubt, it could have been New Haven, places like that. And the goods would be auctioned off, and they would get some portion of the money. It was very lucrative and extremely dangerous. But they went out, they captured a British merchant ship, they brought it into Boston, actually back to Philadelphia. He got the prize money, and he gave most of the prize money to the people in New Jersey who had saved his life. So he goes back out again. He says, this is a pretty good deal. I think I'll keep doing that. He gets captured again. This time he's in prison in England. And they bring him to New York, and he spends 2 years on a prison ship in New York. So 2 years on one of those awful prison ships. Luckily he didn't die of disease. At the end of the war, he goes back into the merchant service. So he's now trading regularly and makes 45 voyages to the West Indies, down to the Caribbean islands. 45 voyages over the course of a little less than 20 years. So several voyages a year, a couple of voyages a year, going back and forth trading with the Caribbean islands. But it's his last 2 voyages that are the most interesting. In 1793, he went to Africa, purchased over 100 slaves, and brought them to Cuba. This is the classic triangle. He had been going down to the Caribbean, bringing local goods like beef and pork and barreled fish, lumber, down to the Caribbean, which is actually supporting the slave economy, because then you're bringing back sugar and molasses produced by slave labor. So it's an indirect way of supporting the slave economy. This time he decided to get involved in what we call the classic triangle trade, You bring rum from, in his case, from Newport, bring the rum to Africa, trade it for slaves, bring the slaves to Cuba or some other place in the Caribbean, sell them, and then pick up molasses to bring back to the distilleries that were all over the place, but mostly in Newport. So classic triangle trade. Slavery was legal in the United States. This is before the Civil War. It's illegal in Massachusetts. It's legal in other parts of the state, of the country. But the slave trade was illegal. The African slave trade was illegal in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So what he was doing was illegal. He was actually going out of Newport to do this. The ship was owned by Newport owners. So what he was doing was illegal in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And in the year after he made this voyage, it became illegal by federal law as well. So then he goes on a second journey in 1795. And at this point, he picks up again about 100 slaves or so, brings them to Cuba. At that point, he was breaking laws that were Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and federal law. He was very successful in those two voyages. So successful that he then decided to get married. He was 40 by then, decided to get married just a few months after the second slaving voyage. By the way, I just found out 2 days ago, someone sent me an email that had a clipping from a newspaper, Newport newspaper, 1795, talking about Barney Hicks coming back from Africa in his ship being struck by lightning, and 2 people, including one Westport, died in this. And I've been thinking about this, and I'm just wondering if that's why he only went on 2 slaving voyages. There's a sign there, so makes you wonder about that. But I just heard that 2 days ago. History is always evolving. I keep learning things when I think I've got it down. He got married. He had 12 children with his wife, Sarah Cook. And he had a surprisingly long life. He lived to 78, considering what he had been through. It's just amazing that they lived that long. But, as we'll talk about at the end, how do we judge this guy? He's a very complex character. And we have to think, how do we think about him when we hear his whole story? But we'll talk about that at the end. My third sketch is about Paul Cuffey, whom most of you, of course, have heard of. But only one aspect of his life, because we could talk for days about, and people had, in fact, had seminars that went on for days on Paul Cuffey. He was a mariner, he was a shipbuilder, he was a philanthropist. But what I want to concentrate on is just this one thing about his life, which was his desire to reverse the direction of the slave trade and to bring black Americans to Africa. He was very interested in Africa. His father was from Africa. He had philanthropic reasons for caring about Africa. He had religious reasons. He thought that Christianizing these heathen Africans would be a good thing. But he had commercial reasons as well. He really wanted to set up trade, bringing things like palm oil and various other African products and trading with them for products from here in the Dartmouth region. And so he had all those things in mind when he went on one of the ships that he, in fact, had built in Westport, to Sierra Leone, which is the British colony in West Africa. And he went there in 2 months, stayed there for 2 months, got a real sense of the place. And then he went to England. He met some of the great anti-slavery people like William Wilberforce. But then the War of 1812 came up, and he was unable to go there for a while. He had to put it on hold. But in late 1815, after the War of 1812 was over, he went to Sierra Leone with 38 black Americans who wanted to resettle, not resettle, but settle in Africa, based on the idea that they couldn't get a fair deal in America, that their possibilities would be greatly increased by going to Africa. This is also a commercial venture, and the commercial part just didn't work out very well. He also had to pay for most of these people to go over. He lost $8,000 on the voyage, so it was not anywhere near the kind of success that he had hoped it might be. Soon after he got back, he was contacted by the American Colonization Society. That was an organization that was pretty much new then, and their goal was to settle free blacks who were not enslaved in America, and to settle them in a new colony of Liberia. The Liberia that we know today in Africa was created by the United States and the American Colonization Society right around this time. This was considered a good idea by a lot of people, including the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. He said initially, anyway, he says, I think this is a pretty good idea. This idea of creating a colony in Liberia to give better opportunities for black Americans. But after a short while, it was pretty much decided that this wasn't such a great idea for black Americans. The goal of this was not to end slavery. The goal was to get rid of free blacks. And so it was a very cynical organization, as it turns out. There were a lot of ministers who were involved in it, and there were a lot of very famous people, including James Madison. He was one of the vice presidents. But James Madison owned 100 slaves. He had no intention whatsoever of ending slavery. And so people began to realize, people like William Lloyd Garrison, began to realize over a fairly short period of time that the American Colonization Society was not working for the benefit of black Americans. But they contacted Paul Cuffe, and they hinted that he might be a wonderful governor of this new colony of Liberia. He never commented too much on that, and it was a short while after that offer in 1817 that he died. So he never got to follow up either with a second trip or to follow up with the Colonization Society. This idea was later rejected. One of the great quotes is by the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who wrote in 1849, "We are of the opinion that the free colored people generally mean to live in America and not in Africa. We do not mean to go to Liberia. Our minds are made up to live here if we can, or die here if we must." So, a very clear statement that the American Colonization Society, this whole idea, was not an anti-slavery movement at all. So that was 30 years, he wrote that 30 years after Cuffe's death. So we have to wonder, what would Cuffe, had he lived longer, what he would have thought. My own belief is that he would have rejected the idea, just as people like Frederick Douglass did. And he might have agreed that his own experience, which was fighting for black equality, while also making a commercial success of his own life, would have been a better approach. My fourth sketch is about a man named Daniel Martin. This is relatively new stuff, I think, or I subtitled it "Slavery by a Different Name." Sometime in 1792, a Westport captain, a maritime captain, not a whaler, by the name of William Howland, made a trip to one of the Caribbean islands, we don't know which one, and he acquired an indentured servant, a 6-year-old boy by the name of Daniel Martin. I don't know what Daniel's first name was. It probably wasn't Daniel Martin, but he became known as Daniel Martin. Most likely, Daniel's mother was paid for this. Most likely. We don't really know. We don't have anything from her. And whether she did it for the money, or if she did it because she thought Daniel would have a better chance in America, we just really don't know. But we do know that there was a formal indenture, a legal indenture, of this boy to Captain William Howard. And he was brought to Westport to live with the Howlands. But it's pretty clear that his dark skin and this condition of involuntary servitude would make his situation quite similar to slavery. Indentured servitude was legal. It differed from slavery in that it wasn't forever. It had a time period. Might be some number of years, 7 years, it might be till the child turns 21 or 25. It varied. But so it wasn't forever, and it wasn't hereditary, the way slavery is. But otherwise, the servant was legally under the complete control of the master. Not too far different from slavery. We don't know much about Daniel's early years in Westport. Maybe he was trained in seamanship by his master, who was a master mariner. We do know that in 1800, when Daniel was 14, William Howland died, which would have been, of course, a wonderful time to free him from the indenture. But he didn't. Instead, they rewrote the indenture to William Howland's wife, Nancy Howland. Daniel's response to this was to run away. Not surprisingly, he went to sea. And you can figure that that would be natural for someone in a seafaring town like Westport. The sea was also far away from the authorities who might come after him. It was illegal for him to run away after all. Also, there was kind of a rough equality at sea. If you could do your job, you usually were pretty much left alone. It doesn't mean that there wasn't racism, but there apparently was less discrimination than there was on land. His escape started off pretty well. The first job that we know that he got was on a ship called the Caledonia, which was a merchant ship that went to China. So he was on that for 13 and a half months. He was paid $162 for it, actually not bad for the time. Then he went on another merchant ship called the Neptune. They were in the Bay of Biscay off of France, and they were intercepted by the British Navy. The British Navy at this time, early 1800s, was out looking for, they would board ships all the time, especially American ships, looking for deserters from the British Navy. And they would impress these seamen, as it was called. If they found somebody that they thought had been in the British Navy and had run away or deserted, they would take them. And 4 of them were taken, including Daniel, even though he had never been. They said, this guy, we have some evidence that this guy deserted from the British Navy, and they took him. And they forced him into service in the British Navy on a ship called the Melampus. He was on it for 15 months, and the Melampus happened to be off the coast of Virginia at one time, and there was some sort of party going on the deck, and he and 4 others escaped to land in Virginia. He decided that his best bet at that point was to join the U.S. Navy. So he did. And he was assigned to a naval frigate called the Chesapeake. This proved to be bad luck. And the reason was that the Chesapeake, when it went out with him on board, was followed by a British man-of-war called the Leopard. And they boarded the Chesapeake and said, these 4 people are deserters from the British Navy, and you have to give them up. And the captain said, not a chance. The boarding party got back on their own ship, and they immediately started firing on the Chesapeake in an embarrassingly short battle. The Chesapeake was defeated. They then boarded and took Daniel Martin and 3 others into the British Navy. This Chesapeake Leopard affair is actually a big deal in American history. It's one of the things that, when you ever read about the War of 1812, one of the contributing factors, even though this was some years, 5 years before the war, one of the contributing factors is the Chesapeake Leopard affair. So here's Daniel Martin in the middle of this. They brought him to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he was sentenced to 500 lashes, which was commuted. So he did not receive those lashes. But this was a deadly serious business because one of the other ones that was taken with him was hanged, was executed. So, deadly business. The U.S. authorities did a lot of research, and they said this guy, in fact, they even wrote to the widow Howland and ask about him. And she said, oh yeah, this is the story. That's how we know his story really, was in the State Department papers that she wrote back to the State Department answering their questions. So they knew he was American. They worked to get him free, but it took 5 years. And in 1812, he was brought to the Charleston Navy Yard, and the Chesapeake happened to be in the Charlestown Navy Yard at the time. So he goes back on the Chesapeake. More bad luck. 11 months later, the Chesapeake faced off with a British man-of-war called the Shannon. And in that defeat by the Shannon, the Chesapeake suffered 48 Americans killed, one of whom was Daniel Martin. He lived to be, we think, 27 years old. And he experienced very little freedom in his life. From the age of 6 to 15, he was a servant against his will. From 15 to 19, he was a merchant man on a couple of different ships, probably the best years of his life, really. From 19 to 27, he was either in forced military service or in British prison. And so, except for those few years in his teens, he had a life of slavery, although called by various other names. My final story is about a man named Edward Duvall from Westport. And this is actually part of a much larger project that I'm working on. I'm presenting at a seminar on New England maritime history at historic Deerfield this summer. But this is a shortened form of it. He was born in Westport, 1822. When he was 17, he went whaling on a ship called the Elizabeth out of Westport Point. He liked it, he was good at it. He went out on the Elizabeth on its next voyage, and then decided to move to New Bedford because there were more whaling opportunities there. And the opportunities were good. He made captain by the age of 25, which wasn't unheard of, but it was pretty unusual. This guy was, he knew every aspect. In fact, we have at the Whaling Museum, they have a set of orders that he wrote, and shows his incredible knowledge of all of the aspects of all the jobs on a whaling ship. He was also a real strict disciplinarian, but a very, as we used to say in the Coast Guard, a very squared away sailor. In 1850, he married Lizzie Brownell from Westport. He was 28, she was 20. We do have letters between them, but none from this period. But I've sort of imagined the kind of life they thought they would have as a married couple. All they had to do was walk down Main Road to the docks at Westport Point and look at the houses on both sides. These houses of whaling captains and whaling agents, they were the best houses on the street. They're still the best houses on the street. And they could imagine a life where he made a fair amount of money as a whaling captain, and then he could retire from sea duty and do something else. He could be a whaling agent. He could own parts, shares of whaling ships. He could make money. He could do well. And you can kind of imagine that they had this idea of a really good life, despite the fact that while he was a captain, he wouldn't be home much. In fact, he was rarely home, as it turns out. They had a daughter in 1854. I think they actually had a son before that, but then he disappeared, so he clearly died. They had a daughter in 1854 named Carrie. He was actually home for her birth, which was somewhat unusual, but he had to leave when she was 12 days old on his next voyage. And that voyage was on a ship called the Iris, which had been built in Westport, but it sailed out of New Bedford. It was built in 1818, so by this time, 1850s, it's getting pretty old, and maybe that was the reason that it sprung a leak in the Indian Ocean. And so they decided they had to go somewhere to pull it up onto shore and get it repaired. So they pulled into the port called Port Gregory, which is on the western coast of Australia, about 300 miles north of Perth. They anchored in the harbor, and during one of the nights, nobody was on the ship at the time, a violent storm came up, and it pulled away from all three anchors that it had, and it was dashed on the shore, and it was a total loss, a total wreck. They did manage to salvage some equipment that they sold. They managed to salvage about 100 barrels of whale oil, which they sold. But this was an incredible personal and professional and financial embarrassment for Captain Duvall. And this was made worse by the fact that when the crew left, the crew stayed around for a little while, and he stayed longer, but the 25 crew members left. Only one, he wrote, shook his hand upon leaving. So they were very upset with this guy. They may have been upset with him before. He was a pretty strict disciplinarian, but they clearly held him responsible. These guys would get nothing from that voyage, absolutely nothing. They had to somehow make their way back to the United States from Australia, which would take months. In a letter that he wrote home, very curious letter, he said, "I love Australia. I think I'm going to stay here for a year," which I'm sure his wife was really happy to hear. He said, because this is a place where there's a lot going on. And he said, if I had a couple $100, I could make a couple $1,000 in a year. This is somewhere between highly speculative and illegal. I mean, there's something about it that suggests that he may have been. And there were some interesting illegal things going on in the maritime business of Australia at the time. We have no, this is just speculation on my part. I have no belief that he did it, but it's interesting based on what happens later. But in any case, he didn't have any money. He didn't have that couple $100 to invest. In fact, he was going to make nothing on this voyage. And he owed his father money, he owed his father-in-law money. He wasn't actually doing all that well. So he decided to come home. Came back to New England, signed up with a ship out of Mattapoisett, had a pretty successful 2-year voyage, signed up again on the same ship for a 2-year voyage, but in 3 months, when they were in the Azores, he got off. Supposedly, the records say he was ill. He got off in the Azores, and the ship went on without him. And at that point, we have no information about his whereabouts for a year. When he does show up, it's back in New Bedford as the captain of a whaler called the Brutus. The Brutus had been a whaler out of Warren, Rhode Island in the 1850s. And it was sold at auction to a company from New York in the spring of 1860, and then quickly resold to a New Bedford wholesale liquor dealer by the name of Albert Bigelow, who had never had anything to do with whaling before. This immediately aroused suspicion, the 2 quick sales. Also because the New York owner, a man named Pierre Pierce, was known to have been involved in the slave trade. It was in 1860, so he's involved in the slave trade. And they know that. He's never been prosecuted, especially in New York, where prosecutions for the slave trade almost always ended up without convicting because of sympathetic juries and corrupt legal system at the time. Slave trade had been illegal at this point for 50 years, over 50 years. But there were few prosecutions, and it was extremely lucrative. The fact that you could buy a slave in Africa for $40 or $50, sell that same slave in Cuba for $500. Highly lucrative. So the federal authorities from Boston knew that this was suspicious, so they came down to New Bedford, and here's Captain Duvall helping to get this ship outfitted to go out in the month of August of 1860. But it was hard to pin anything because a whaler was a wonderful disguise for a slaver. A slave ship needed, for one thing, you needed the ability to boil a lot of water where you could boil rice to feed 500 slaves or so. Well, a slaver had the try works where they boil blubber. So you say, no, this is for boiling whale blubber. And it's hard to prove that it wasn't for feeding slaves. They also need a tremendous amount of water, many, hundreds of casks of fresh water. Well, a whaler had all kinds of fresh casks on it for whale oil. So a properly equipped whale ship was very hard to distinguish from a ship that was bent on slavery. So just a great disguise. So Duval managed to convince these people that the authorities that there was nothing wrong here. And the Brutus was allowed to clear New Bedford Harbor in August of 1860. They made for the Azores, and Duval got off the ship and didn't come back on. The Brutus, as suspected, made straight for Africa, picked up a Spanish captain on the coast of Africa, went to the mouth of the Congo River, where they bought approximately 650 slaves. 50 of those slaves, during the process of transporting them in small boats from the shore to the Brutus, 50 of them drowned. During the passage to the Caribbean, 100 more died, were thrown overboard. The 500 survivors were sold at Cuba into a lifetime of slavery. The people, the first mate and that Spanish captain, then took the Brutus out and they burned it to destroy evidence. Now, this shows you how lucrative this was. You could burn the ship and still make a tremendous amount of money, make thousands and thousands of dollars. Another measure of the profitability was that each of the sailors, the common sailors, made $500. In fact, the going rate was $1 a head. So if you landed 500 healthy slaves, each of the crew members, each of the ordinary seamen would get $500. This was about, for 6 months' work, this was, what, 8 or 10 times more than they would probably make on a whale ship or on a legitimate merchant marine voyages. The high wages, as well as fear, kept these crewmen from ever talking much about this. But one of the guys on the ship, he was from Belchertown, Mass., came down to New Bedford, wanted to go whaling, had never been to sea before, and then he finds himself not on a whaling voyage, but on a slave voyage. And usually, again, because of fear and the fact that it was so lucrative, they usually, if they were surprised by that, they usually kept their mouth shut. But this guy went to the authorities, federal authorities. And the Federal District Court at Boston began an investigation. So meanwhile, through all this is happening, we left Captain Duval in the Azores. He comes back to New Bedford before any of this is known. Okay, and it just hasn't come out yet. He comes back to New Bedford, and he gets on another ship, a small schooner called the Palmyra, for an Atlantic voyage. So he's out at sea. And while he's away, the owners of the Brutus have been indicted in Boston. And this guy, Pierre Pierce, the one from New York, he posts a $10,000 bail, and then he takes off, leaves the country, probably goes to Cuba, we don't know. He never comes back. So $10,000 to him was not a big deal. The other guy, Albert Bigelow, the liquor dealer, I think he was just kind of, had no idea what he was doing in this whole thing. Was just foolish and greedy. He was found guilty of having engaged in some fashion in the slave trade. He was fined and he spent 5 years in prison. When Duval, now this is all happening, Duval is out back at sea again on the Palmyra. When he comes back, he's arrested and he's indicted for engaging in the slave trade. Now, he never did himself buy and sell slaves, but the law was very clear. If you do anything to outfit a ship, to help outfit a ship, in any way aid that process of involvement in a whaling voyage, even if you didn't actually buy and sell slaves yourself, you're still guilty. He could have received the same punishment as Bigelow. By the way, right around this time, a captain named Gordon, Nathaniel Gordon from Maine, was arrested. He actually was caught with slaves on his ship, the third time at least that he had been out. And he was brought to trial in New York, and usually you got away with it. But the Lincoln administration had come in, and the Lincoln administration said, we're not going to put up with this. And so they brought in new judges and so forth. And Gordon was, much to his surprise, found guilty of piracy, and he was hanged. So the consequences were dire. And here's Duvall, who's going to be tried for this. But while he was awaiting trial, he contracted typhoid fever and died. This is in April of 1863. He was 40 years old. 9 months later, his wife Lizzie follows him to the grave. She died of consumption, at least that was official, but it's hard not to think that stress and heartbreak had something to do with it. And their daughter Carrie obviously suffered tremendously from this. She was 9 years old when all this happened. She went to live with Lizzie's sister in Westport. She never did marry. She died at the age of 38. So a very sad family story where Carrie and Lizzie were the unintended victims. The intended victims, the direct victims, of course, were the 650 Africans who either drowned getting onto the ship or died in the passage or were condemned to lifetimes of slavery in Cuba. It seems that Duvall acted out of greed. This would be just kind of a quick voyage. He wouldn't even be directly involved in it himself. He would just help get the ship out, and he would add legitimacy to the voyage. And this would relieve the financial pressure that he seemed to be under. But of course, what's harder to understand is the greed we understand. We may not like it, but we understand it. But it's the moral indifference that would allow a man to play a part, any part, in the buying and selling of other human beings. Now, in all these stories tonight, we have to always be careful of applying our 21st century sensibilities to things that happened 150, 200, 250 years ago. We have to consider the particular conditions, prevailing attitudes of the time. Barney Hicks presents us with a problem because if we're talking about Barney Hicks for 10 minutes, for the first 8 minutes, he's a hero. What an amazing guy. And then the last 2 minutes, he's a villain. So it makes it difficult to come up with some sort of overall assessment of somebody like Barney Hicks. He had done this Caribbean trade for 20 years, and he was, as I said, helping, in some ways, helping slavery to maintain slavery, because he was bringing goods down there that would feed the slaves, and he was bringing back molasses, which was and sugar, which were the products of their work. But he did cross over that line, and he himself went to Africa. He himself bought and sold human beings in this trade. Captain Duvall, up until the age of about 38, this is a pretty good story with a little bit of, a fast rise through the ranks of whaling. Ends up with a bit of bad luck, but at that point he then breaks federal law, Massachusetts law. Although at the time, it's important to note that there were many people who argued that, wait a minute, you can own a slave in Virginia and sell that slave in Mississippi, and that's legal. But you can't buy a slave in Africa and bring him to Cuba? Doesn't make sense. People did make that argument. Of course, the moral, there's a hole in that argument, which is the moral argument. But they said this just isn't right. If the internal slave trade is legal in the South, which it was, why would we care about the external trade? And maybe this is what people like Captain Duvall thought. It's not a big deal. It doesn't affect the United States at all. It's just cargo. It's just cargo. They may have saw it that way. So for us, evaluating all of this, somewhere between the moral sensibilities of the time and our own time, we make our judgments. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer some questions. Yes?
Now, Barney Hicks was a slave himself, right? No, oh, I thought he was, okay, sorry.
No, Barney,
Oh, okay.
no, Barney was not.
All right.
He was not.
Okay. Now, I have another
Mhm.
question. Didn't Abraham Lincoln himself advocate that free black men should go to Liberia?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Abraham Lincoln held on. Abraham Lincoln would say, I have no idea how to solve this problem. He was convinced that blacks and whites could not live together in the same country. And despite his own, much more open feelings. But he said, and so he desperately looked for a solution. And one of the solutions was colonization, either in Africa or in South America. He did do that. He changed near the end. I think Frederick Douglass kind of changed his mind, certainly near the end, but he did advocate that. Yeah.
My curiosity, Tony, is the work that you said, I don't know what year, I can't recall, but there were like 580 something or 500 something.
In Bristol County.
In Bristol County,
Yeah.
Taunton, and in Dartmouth.
Yeah.
Now, what work were these slaves doing, on farms, or were there, is a specific work,
I don't know.
yeah.
I honestly don't know. Some of it would have clearly been farming. I mean, there was a lot, for example, there were these plantations in Rhode Island Province plantation, where there really was plantation work going on. A lot of them were working in maritime sort of jobs, or working on the docks, stevedores, and various other kind of jobs where they were, it's not the classic southern slavery that you think of, but they were doing things like that. And there was a lot of industrial stuff going on in Taunton. And my guess is they might have been working in some of those industrial settings as well.
And by the owners of
Yes.
those businesses?
Yes.
Now, as far as the...
Or not necessarily, they may have been, sometimes, especially in the north, you would hire out the slaves, and so they might have hired them out to do industrial work.
The other question was, I know I read, there may have been a book that George took out of the UMass Library, that there were maybe in 1 in 5 households, there was Indian, Wampanoag slaves, that the Indians, after the King Philip's War, they were put into slavery.
They were,
What do you know
but
about that?
yes, they were put in slavery. Many of the men after the Civil War, after the King Philip's War, but they were shipped to places like Barbados, Bermuda, because the idea was if they were local, they could escape.
But what about the women?
The women who were not.
Households, maybe. That's what I heard.
What's that? There were some, but for the most part it was men. There were some women and children, in fact, for that matter, that were also sold into slavery. There were people who said after King Philip's War, they said, look at all the trouble that these people caused us. We got to get some. It cost us a lot of money, so let's sell them. And that's really what was the attitude. It was mostly men, but there were women and children. But typically what happens is you ship them out, and oddly enough, or interesting enough, there were slaves from places like the Carolinas, who were Indians from the Carolinas who were enslaved and brought up here. So you'll actually find Carolina slaves, Indian slaves up here, and Wampanoag slaves in other places. Just to keep on
It's supposed to be, just to follow up on that, Tony, it's supposed to be the reason for the escalation of the King Philip War, in that in Dartmouth, when the Indians were surrendered, they were promised by a church they would not be
That's right.
abused. The people in Plymouth took them and sold them and sent them away. And allegedly, one of the women and one of the children are King Philip's wife and son. And that was the escalation of the war.
Really? I never heard that. That'd be fascinating.
No, I hadn't heard that either.
Yeah.
I didn't make it up.
Yeah, no, I never.
When Massachusetts made slavery illegal, were the slave owners reimbursed by the state?
No, they were not.
At one point, the federal government was doing that early in the Civil War.
There were always plans for compensated emancipation. And I think some places did it, maybe certain states, but there was never a federal program of compensated emancipation, mainly because people just added up the numbers and said, can't do it. Absolutely can't do it. so that never happened. And my understanding is that in Massachusetts, there was no compensation. It just said, because it wasn't the legislature kind of working out a deal. It was a legal thing that said, this is illegal, and that did it.
I'm not late, but Zip and the Zip in Holland,
What about Zip?
what was it, the red given names, or that was a name that?
Zip, I've seen 3 different names for him. One was something like Zilphia,
Okay.
and then there was another name, but Zip seems to show up more often than others. My guess is it is a shortened form. Richard might know. What do they show in the deeds?
It's either Zip or SIP, both
Zip, Zip.
versions.
Okay, yeah. But I've seen other names, but not often, you know. Most of the time it's just Zip, which is probably a shortened.
I thought, one thought I had, it might even be short possibly for Scipio. They used a lot of.
Oh, Roman,
names
like
from
Roman
Greek,
names, yeah.
Roman history and stuff like
Oh,
Caesar,
it's like Scipio.
and names like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
I didn't
I have
know
seen
that.
the name Scipio for
Yeah.
local slaves.
Yeah,
That's what
okay. That's all I know.
Because, yeah, just kind of, okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
okay.
Over here.
Yes.
What was the date of that Massachusetts act making it illegal? And can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances and arguments of it? And are there any figures who advocated that act that we should remember and admire?
There were 3 cases. I don't have the names of them. They came up in 1781, 82. And in each case, they were slaves who themselves, or under their own names, sued for their freedom. And I don't know the name of the owners, but it is in the, you know, the Massachusetts records, judicial records, that they have it. And it went up through local courts up to the state Supreme Court. And then the decree came from them, again, not legislative, but judicial, in 1783, and it said this is incompatible. I honestly don't know much of the details about it, but there are court records that are
And
there.
how many judges were on that?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, they deserve some credit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just for general information, there's the executive director of the Little Compton Historic Society, who also gives a talk on slavery, which adds to what Tony's been talking about. And it's very interesting. She's agreed to come and talk with us. We haven't set the date yet. It's not even on the to-be scheduled thing, but she and I have talked.
Yeah,
She's
and
talking
she has a
about-
lot more detail. She may be able to, Marjorie O'Toole was her name, she may be able to answer your question. She's got a lot more, very specific detail with names and dates and stuff.
Now, I also heard a statistic from another historian that at a certain point, 1 out of every 4 families in all of Massachusetts had a slave or so. Would you know if they were claimed as dependents? And were there any records demographically or as to
The
where
IRS
most of the
looks
slaves were living in Massachusetts?
There are records that there's in 1754 there was a slave census for the whole state, and you can actually find town by town. That's how I know that there were 38 adult slaves in Dartmouth in 1754. You can find it for every town in Massachusetts.
Would there have been a huge amount in Boston area?
There would have been a lot in Boston, probably more in Boston than anywhere else, yes.
Would you say, or this is only speculation on my part, but would you say that the increase of slave households, that, you know, people who had slaves in their households, increased maybe because the reporting finally came through and that there actually had been more slaves prior to this, but they hid it?
That's an interesting thing. We've got two dates with very different figures.
Yeah,
And
they're close.
but it doesn't tell you whether it was, it's just like people say, oh, more people have this disease than ever before. You say, well, more people are reporting it. So,
Right.
so it may in fact be that. I honestly don't know. I kind of just trust these figures. I throw them out just to give you some sense of scale. But I really don't know. And we need to know those numbers.
Is it possible that the difference in the period is mostly economic growth?
My guess is that it does have more to do with economic growth, because there were more things that slaves could do. There was just more trade, more farming, whatever it happened to be. And I think economics probably Because I can't see it anything else. It wasn't like people were saying, oh, I better get these slaves while I can because, you know, they're gonna go away or something. I mean, this would be, you know, jumping ahead too far to.
Well, that's, and a
think
lot
that-
of the economic growth was not have been in farming, but in trade with the
Trade.
West Indies,
Trade more than anything else.
Chesapeake.
Yes, yeah. And the other thing is, the slaves were mostly coming in through Rhode Island. And there was a growth in that slave trade. And so you can just see more of them coming to Rhode Island, more of them making their way into Massachusetts from there. And that was economic growth, probably. So you probably got the number of it right there.
Did you get the dollar figure on what a slave would cost in Massachusetts? You got the one in Cuba.
Yeah.
Or in Massachusetts, because of its economic
It
growth.
varied over time, but they were up in the like in Virginia, for example. If a slave was worth $40 or $50 in Africa, 500 in Cuba, they were probably worth 800 or so, maybe even 1,000 sometimes. A healthy male slave would go for close to $1,000
Keep in
in
mind that they
Virginia.
were auctioned, so
Yeah.
the prices vary.
Yeah, very times, but that gives you some sense of it. Yes.
The ages and so forth.
Question?
Yeah, Tony, could you speak to the Underground Railroad in this area?
That's an interesting subject that needs a lot more, and the reason I kind of chuckle is because everyone who comes to the Handy House says, so, show us where they hid the slaves. We said, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but we really have no evidence of it at all. And the reason is that they're upstairs around the chimney, there's this closet that kind of goes into the chimney. Of course, it's one of the hottest places in the house, so I don't know how anybody could have stayed there for any length of time. But, so everybody just assumes that it was. And it's one of those things where everybody wants to have been a part of the Underground Railroad or something. And so you find all these stories. There's no evidence of it at the Handy House that we can find. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. But a lot of them in this area, they came in by water. So the Underground Railroad was really the over the ocean railroad where you get the coasting trade. There were people from Westport and Dartmouth and New Bedford and all that went all along the coast, from Maine down to Virginia, places like that. And there's all these stories. There's a wonderful book called The Fugitives Gibraltar. I can't remember the name of the woman who wrote it.
Catherine Grove.
What's that? Catherine Grove, thank you very much. And it's really good, but it tells you all about these things. Captains going down there, and they sneak a slave or two on board, you know, who comes to them, and they bring them up to New Bedford and all that. So a lot of it happened over water. And we don't have as many stories, I don't think there's as many true ones as the stories that get told. But that's really all I know about.
You know, a lot of the towns that you say were Rhode Island, brought in the slaves, but a lot of those 5 towns over there were part of Massachusetts. Bristol, Rhode Island, it was Bristol, Massachusetts, Barrington. You know,
Yes.
that's all along the water.
Yeah, that's Bristol County, Rhode Island, that was part of Massachusetts, but I believe that was 1742,
Yeah.
something like that, where they
That's-
changed over. But that was actually, sorry, that, Plymouth Colony actually extended all the way to that, exactly right, exactly right. Yes?
I don't think we should forget where they came from and why. What were some of the tribes or countries that provided slaves for the trade and why?
I don't know, I know some of the names of them, but I don't really, I've not really done much of a study of the African side of this. They came from all over though, because a lot of them came from the interior, because there was a network of slave trading. Slaves that had been captured in war. After a while, this was so lucrative that you could bring slaves, you know, to the coast of the Congo or pretty much anywhere along the west coast of Africa. And so, because they were worth so much, you get all these people who were going into the interior. So there were a lot of different tribes, or a lot of different people. Much of Africa was involved in that. We might have more.
So, to answer your question, Ghana
Ghana.
is one of them.
Yeah.
Along the coast of Ghana, there's almost 59 or 60 slave coasts. That was just really in Ghana alone.
Just in Ghana.
Just in Ghana alone. There was close to almost 60 million Africans that were taken from their homeland in Africa. Close to 60 million.
Yeah.
And I know people sometimes confused, like, who were involved in the slave. Africans were not involved in that slave. It was a different kind of stories. So Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, the African countries, West Africa, and go to East and towards Angola, Congo. They were part of the country. Then we go to the north, Mali, Guinea. These are the countries, but mostly came from Ghana. Most of the slaves actually were taken from Ghana, along the coast of West Africa.
And at different times, it also changed, because there was a time in the 1850s, for example, the Congo turned out to be one of the largest
The
places.
first castle was born in 1442. The first slave castle in Ghana, 1442, called Elibina.
Yeah, very early.
Elibina Castle, yeah,
Yeah,
I think.
that was through the Portuguese.
The Portuguese,
Yes,
yes.
exactly.
1442 was the first castle also built in Ghana.
Yeah, yeah. That's a whole fascinating subject, which I will freely admit that I don't really know enough about. Okay? Thank you.
Very good.